Brought to you by DK Audio.
DK Audio presents Shared Remains by Rachel Lynch, read by Clare Kissane. Chapter 1. The road was brutally unforgiving, and the vehicle bumped and jumped about. The occupants of the truck were used to it, having lived here on the land for decades. Farmers across the Lake District didn't need fancy bits of tarmac crisscrossing their land. They preferred to leave them to the elements. That way, nosy tourists were kept out by the potholes and muddy crossing points, where the road disappeared into slate, boulder and marsh. It didn't matter how many private land signs one hammered to trees and gates. Some bloody adventurer from the south always thought they could wander around with an upside-down map looking for paradise. Cracks and crevices, which filled with rocks and water from the outlying hills, froze over in winter, and only the very basic maintenance jobs made them barely drivable, or at least fairly even. Come spring, everything thawed and mulched into one sloppy mush with the rain. In summer, the dirt dried to dust and great piles of rubble fell away under the wheels. Autumn was unpredictable. It could be hot or cold, muddy or dry, and one took their chances along the track. If you got stuck, no one was coming to help, that was for sure. For a start, it was miles to the nearest telephone box, if it still worked after being decommissioned by British Telecom years ago. The red ones ended up at auction, or in celebrity houses, where they were showed off to hangers-on who cooed at how quirky and quaint they were, while exhibiting their own rarity and privilege by the very fact they had one. Secondly, it was private land, and nobody would know you were there. And thirdly, farmer got to you first. Well then, you'd sooner have a shotgun pellet in your backside than face him. The vast marsh-like valley between the A66 that sliced the North Fells off from the rest of them, the wilderness of Dockwray to the south, the last hamlet before the glory of Ullswater, and the Helvellyn Range to the west, was to those who knew once one vast farm owned by the Morningside family. The sheep loved the flat, spongy grassland, and the little balls of white wool dotted the landscape, making it look like a child's play farm when gazed upon from the road. Protected woodland was scattered about like bunches of Christmas trees, similar to the ones sold to decorate cakes here and there, as if plopped down by the same kids playing with the farm. The trees hugged one another, as if for safety, and the outer ones stood tall and proud, daring anyone brave enough to venture in. The fading October light was beautiful, but the driver and his companion weren't here to gaze at the view. Locals of the Lake District were over-familiar with the hills that never went anywhere. The sunset dipped in the same place every day, and the lakes and hidden waterfalls had been forged by ancient rock long before the photographs that snapped them were discarded. The two men concentrated on the road ahead and the fact that it'd soon be dark. Orange and purple turned to dark grey. The nights were drawing in, and it'd soon be time to put the clocks back. Spring forward, fall back. The chassis was their biggest concern as they tumbled over the uneven surface. Was she strong enough to hold? The thud of boulders hitting the wheel arches clanged like metallic ghouls inside their heads and reverberated around the metal bodywork. The sharper stones pinged off the side like a percussion accompaniment. There was no radio signal, so it was the only symphony of sorts they were going to enjoy this evening. Both men wobbled this way and that and held onto the ceiling straps for comfort and safety. At least the driver had the steering wheel to cling onto, for good measure. A rough ride in a truck wasn't something that scared them, but being bashed against the doorframe was. A big enough hole in the road could send you into it at a rate of knots and break your arm. The driver kept his hand on the wheel and his right hand on the band above his head, squinting to see in the fading light. He didn't use headlights, and he didn't change gear. There was no point. and he knew where he was going. He constantly needed the thrust of first gear to get out of yet another gaping aperture. He navigated by listening to the engine. There was also no point in talking. They'd have their conversation back in the pub when they'd finished, and didn't have to shout over the din. It was thirsty work, all this concentration, and a lot of effort, but they were paid handsomely for it. Jobs were getting harder to find in Cumbria. Foreign transient workers, who were cheap, took all the catering jobs. Farming and forestry positions were declining as fast as the Titanic went down, leaving little else, apart from drug running, which was a good earner but could land you a hefty stint at His Majesty's pleasure. Something legal and well paid was what everybody desired, but didn't get. So this was good work, if you could get it. It wasn't the type of position you could simply apply for, and it didn't require GCSEs or apprenticeships, which was fortunate because the two men had dropped out of school as soon as they could. Education was for the high and mighty, and those who paid attention to teachers droning on about stuff that didn't matter. It was a waste of time for anybody wanting to get a real job, in the real world. The engine stopped screaming, and the light shifted as they entered the forest. It had been raining all morning, but in the late afternoon, as was not uncommon in these parts, the drizzle had stopped and the sun had come out, as if God was announcing that he was ready for his dinner. Swords of light had dropped from the clouds and, facing west, threw piercing rods of silver onto the surrounding land. Now there were only shadows as they entered the forest. "This is the spot, lad." The driver pulled off, adjacent to a grass field, and the change in driving surface was akin to sleeping in silk sheets after having only a scratchy woolen blanket for 10 nights. The landowner at least looked after this part of the road, because he'd once had a harebrained idea to open a bird sanctuary. That is, until they all died. Then an alpaca centre, until they died too. Weary of what it took to keep exotic animals alive, he gave up and tried something new. Others thought Arthur Morningside was cursed by his father. Local gossip had it that Percival Morningside bequeathed the fertile half of the farm to his favourite son, Arthur's brother Samuel. And Arthur had been left with just the forest and scrubland. But whatever the reason, it was collectively accepted that Samuel was the better businessman. The narrow lane led to a collection of abandoned outbuildings and a watermill, where the bird sanctuary had been housed for a short while. They stopped the vehicle. The grave had already been dug, under the trees and slightly to the left of the old dry stone sheep pen, used at one time for the Herdwick sheep that had shaped the land around these parts. The old mill, which had stood unused for 100 years or more, and the beck underneath it, made the ground softer here and easier to dig. The smiling white faces of the Herdies, as they were otherwise known, had bent and nodded as they chewed their way over hills and dales for 1,000 years or more. But they weren't here anymore. They were long gone too, over to Samuel's side, having been too much work for Arthur. The Herdies had once been the only serious living to be had here on Morningside Farm. The other animals had been for the tourists, but Arthur couldn't even make that work. The men's heads rattled and buzzed from the rough ride, and their bones felt misplaced inside their skin. But after a shake and a stretch, they were ready to begin their work. They turned off the engine and slammed the truck doors. The noise echoed into the approaching night, inviting anyone on the surrounding fells to call back. But they didn't. It was about as desolate out here as you could get, this side of the newly divided farm. Not even the sound of sheep, from over the boundary of Samuel Morningside's inheritance, pierced the evening sky, just the gentle purr of wind rustling the trees. "Shh! You'll wake her up," one of the men said, bending over, laughing. The other rolled his eyes. "Don't give up your day job, pal." They opened the back of the truck and rolled the tarp towards them. The package had been shaken.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?